这一期我请到了投资人、企业家，同样也是财商教育基金的创办人 Russell Gray。
I've know many people who've known Trump. I've gotten a chance to interact with Donald Trump a couple of times.
我们一起来讨论一下哈，平时一些我们不会去仔细定义，但是呢，却深度影响到我们的行为和思维的一些概念。比如说，为什么通货膨胀不能直接跟货币贬值划等号？那又为什么股市下跌呢？它不一定是经济衰退的信号。
You can have an economy that appears to be robust, but in fact isn't because
那通过和川普的商业和法律团队深度接触，那他会对川普的行为做出什么样的解读呢？
I don't think Donald Trump is anywhere nearly concerned about inflation.
这一期的文字稿在这个描述栏里面哈，我往期的影片的这个文字稿里面也有所有的学术材料链接，都是公开的，欢迎大家去阅读。那在这儿呢，我也多谢各位订阅的观众哈，这么长时间以来的支持和耐心。
And what is the difference between capitalism and socialism?
If you want to be able to go to work and keep the fruits of your labor, then you're a capitalist. A socialist wants the government to control those things. Communism is where the government
I'm going to cut this part out so I don't get into trouble.
经济衰退呢，是我们经常听到描述关于经济越来越不好的这么个名词哈。但是如果只是把经济衰退理解成经济下行的话，那这就是一种非常表面、非常笼统、非常不具体且没有经过深度思考的描述方式了。
I think a lot of people get confused, and I know I was on that list, and I always am aware that I can continue to be on that list of not really understanding when I hear words what the words mean. I think what's happened is because our economy in the United States in particular has become so financialized that we tend to conflate stock performance and specifically stock prices with the health of the economy. And I don't think those are the same thing. And sometimes we can confuse inflation with velocity, meaning that when the economy starts to pick up, it can seem like it's inflationary based on the numbers, but really it's just active. So we've got a situation in the United States where we have a new sheriff in town. That was the name of my talk at the Best Ever conference. I talked about what I thought Donald Trump was trying to do with his policy. And I think that when people worry about a recession in the stock market, or stock investors worry about a recession, they're worried about stock prices falling because revenue and earnings fall because things slow down. People on Main Street just worry about whether they're going to have a job or not. And those are very different things. And I think it's been pretty clear over the last several years that job creation in the United States hasn't been strong. And to be fair, I think part of that is because there are people who don't show up in the job numbers because we've turned into a gig economy. And there's a lot of people out there that got side hustles that don't show up anywhere. They're not going to be on the ADP report. They just don't show up. And so I don't think it's as soft as it might appear after you go in and correct for all these government jobs, which some of which were fake and most of which were not productive. And so when you start really looking at the productive side of the economy, which is not government, and I liken that to a business. If you have a corporation and it has production where it makes the goods and services that it sells, you have sales and marketing that generates the sales and brings the customers in the door. And then you have finance and administration, and that's the group of people that counts the money and supports the people that actually do the work that matters. If you allow the part that is finance and administration to get too big, it sucks resources away from the productive side of the business, which is sales and production. That's what government is. When government gets too big, it sucks resources away from the private sector. And when you measure your economy and you include the government in it, you can have an economy that appears to be robust, but in fact isn't, because the productive side of the economy isn't really producing. And so when you talk about the concept of, are we going to have a recession? I would say if you look at it just based on the way of measuring the overall economy, including government, I think there's a good chance we will have a recession because we're shedding government jobs and government spending. So it's not just the government jobs, but it's the government spending that has been filtered through NGOs. It's been filtered through government contracts, wasteful spending, which I think everybody knew existed. And a lot of that pipeline of money is going to get cut off or slowed down. And so that could have a recessionary effect. And I think that if we have foreign investors who are upset at the United States because of our trade policy and our monetary policy, they may decide to stop buying US assets. And we're talking stocks and bonds. And so if you measure a recession by the performance of the stock market, I would say, there's probably some downward pressure on both stocks and bonds. And we've seen the downward pressure on bonds manifest in higher yields, which of course puts downward pressure on the stock market. So you've got a lot of things pushing things downward. But I don't think on Main Street, which is where my focus is, that that's all necessarily negative. Because in the same breath that you've got, or the same environment that you've got people saying that people are selling America, what they're really saying is they're selling American paper assets. The part that they leave out is there are literally trillions now of dollars that are being invested into America to open up factories and create jobs here in the United States, which is overtly what the Trump administration is trying to create. Roche just is a big pharmaceutical company. Just a few days ago announced $50 billion. The United Arab Emirates has pledged $1.4 trillion over 10 years. Apple has pledged $500 billion. Sony, Honda. So you've got a lot of companies, and that's not going to show up in the stock market, but it's going to show up in Main Street. And so as a real asset investor, as a Main Street investor, what I'm paying attention to is a lot less what's going on in the financial markets. I'm paying attention to this macro trend where we've got a very aggressive, arguably the most aggressive administration, certainly since FDR, that is attempting to convert by force of will and the executive pen this economy from a financialized economy, a Wall Street economy, to an industrial or productive economy, a Main Street economy. And I think, of course, inside of that are tremendous opportunities for Main Street investors. That's why I'm launching my show, The Main Street Capitalist, because I think that that's where all the action is going to be over the next several years if we can make it through this transition.
另外一个比较常见的名词呢，就是通货膨胀。那在解释通货膨胀的时候呢，我们经常会把这通货膨胀等同于货币贬值哈，但这就停留在了货币层面而已哈。但大家想一下，这个通货膨胀和经济衰退，这都是一个现象，而不是原因。
And velocity is a word that a lot of people struggle with understanding. So velocity is how quickly the economy is moving, how they call it currency because it's like electricity and it flows, or blood, it flows through the economy. And so if you think of it like inventory, if you run a little store and you got $1 million of inventory in your store, and every time you turn your inventory, you make, say, a 10% profit margin. If you only turn that inventory once a year, you only make 10% on your $1 million of inventory investment. But if you could turn it twice a year, now that same $1 million is generating 20%. If you can chain it 4 times a year, every quarter, now that same $1 million inventory is generating a 40% return. And so velocity matters. Well, the same thing is true with inflation. So if you have a little tiny bit of inflation, but it's going through the economy very quickly, you're going to have a higher apparent rate of growth, which can be conflated into thinking it's inflation or lost purchasing power. And it may not necessarily be true. So inflation is another word a lot of people don't understand.
自从川普上任以来哈，他就跟这美联储主席 Jerome Powell 他俩不太对付，一个呢迟迟的不降息，另外一个呢觉得这利率太高了。那我们就来从他们各自的身份上出发哈，分别呢去看一下他们的思路是什么样的。那 Ross 作为对于川普的商业逻辑非常了解，也跟川普的团队也有比较深度的交集，甚至呢跟川普本人也有接触过哈，且愿意公开露面去分享他见解的人呢 ，Ross 是这么样解读川普的思路的。
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm also in private market, basically acquisition. So this is the area that we focus on. I'm not super focused on the stock market because honestly, it's not really generating a lot of value to the society. It just the price difference in a millisecond, basically. That's how people make money. So for when you said there are a lot of investments coming into the United States trying to create factories and then companies, this is a part that I'm quite interested. Do you think there's still opportunity for manufacturing business inside the United States? But because the wages are pretty high, and then people are gonna demand the wage going higher. So how is that going to compete with the rest of the world when the wages are much lower?
I think Trump approaches the entire economy the way a builder would, and that makes sense because he's a builder.
Right.
And so it has components. And when you are attempting to have more money to invest in a certain area of a construction project, or you go over budget in a certain area of a construction project, you're going to have to value engineer other components of it to get everything to balance out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's overtly stated that Donald Trump wants to see more middle class jobs created, which means we have to bring back the industries that create those kind of middle class jobs. We can't have, elite financialized jobs on the high end of the spectrum and a bunch of people who are doing nothing but day trading or trading
Right.
claims on other people's productivity and skimming profits, not creating wealth, just skimming profit. They say I'm making money, but they're not really making money. They're not creating wealth. They're just skimming
Yes.
profits. It's a win-lose deal. And so if the idea is to actually get people productive again, then he's going to have higher wages, to your point. But if I'm a business person and you come to me and say, look, I need you, or I'm going to create circumstances where you're going to have to pay a lot more for labor, but I'm going to lower your taxes. I'm going to lower your energy costs. I'm going to lower your regulations and the amount of time and money you have to spend complying, the government red tape. I'm going to lower your transportation costs because guess what? You don't have to ship things all the way across the world. You don't have to pay fees going through the Panama Canal. There's all kinds of costs I can take out of the production process so that you will have more money available to pay for wages. And then through tariffs, I'm going to mute some of the labor cost advantages that our international competitors have. And I think and lower interest rates too. He's pushing hard for lower interest rates. And his argument is he's not trying to stimulate the economy. His argument is very simple, in my opinion, and this is what I've heard him say, is look, the United States is the world's reserve currency. It is the most demanded currency in the world. May not be perfect. I think we could all make that argument, but it's still the most demanded currency. Everybody in every other country would rather hold dollars almost than anything else, except maybe gold, and that's showing up right now. Okay? But if you know that people are going to want to have dollars and dollars are strong, and you realize that debt and the interest on debt is a premium, a risk premium, then you'd have to say, well, okay, if the country that can print dollars to back up its debt is never, ever going to default, that's the argument for MMT. But the difference is we have the world's reserve currency, the most demanded currency. So if there's going to be the safest debt you could buy, the argument could be made, it would be treasuries issued by the United States. Well, if that's true and they're the safest, to Trump's argument, it's the least credit risks, therefore it should be the least interest rate. And it's not reasonable that junk bonds or bonds issued by other countries that don't have the strength of the United States dollar are able to get lower interest rates than we are. It makes us non-competitive. Looking at it as a business person, we got to compete in the world. What are all of our components of cost? And one of our components of cost is interest. It's a big component of cost. So he's attacking, in my opinion, all of these components of costs with the idea that there's two areas he would like to be able to have go up, maybe three. Tariffs, obviously, which potentially impact costs, but I think his argument is that the supply chain going all the way back to the person being tariffed is going to absorb a lot of it. And then he wants to be able to pay more for labor And then he's going to want to be able to have greater velocity. But when you look at Donald Trump versus Jerome Powell being the head of the Fed basically has one tool, and that is it can either loosen money and lending so that velocity can pick up, or it can raise interest rates and constrict money and lending through changing its reserves and its interest rate policy and slow the economy down. And so the Fed, when it is afraid that the economy is going to overheat or prices are going to get too high, they will begin to suppress demand or slow velocity and actually force a recession. They do it in order to prevent runaway inflation in their mind. I don't think Donald Trump is anywhere nearly concerned about inflation because he has a lot more tools to fight it. As I mentioned, he can lower taxes. I mean, he can't do it directly, but he successfully pushed it through last time. I think he's got more momentum this time than he did last time. I expect him to do it. He can lower energy costs, already has. He can put on a lot of pressure for lower interest rates in two ways. One, by bullying the Fed, but also two, by reducing how many treasuries they issue if they're not spending as much. And when they do if they refinance longer term, then eventually those longer term refinances will slow down how quickly the debt has to be rolled over. As a real estate investor, for example,
Right.
a lot of people in the multifamily space used short-term bridge loans as interest rates began to creep up because they were hoping that interest rates would come back down, and they did not want to acknowledge the cost of money had changed. And rather than change their underwriting, they just found a way to put in temporary financing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for a lot of those people, as you probably know, right, clock ran out, interest rates didn't come down, they stayed up.
Exactly.
And now they've
That crushed
got a
the
problem.
market.
Higher cap rates means lower equity, right? So that's a problem. So if Trump, the smart investors, like my partner in the Collective Inner Circle, Kenny McElroy, what he did is he looked at it and he goes, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to refinance these properties and lock in longer term financing.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I'm raising my interest rate, I'm getting rid of a low interest rate that has a shorter period of time, and I'm locking in a longer period of time of stability based on cash flows that I know I can sustain. Yes, it costs me a little bit in cash flow today, but I'm putting some insurance on my position. And I think Trump thinks that way. And I think he would do that. I think he would attempt to refinance longer term the debt to buy himself less turns while he's working on creating a more productive economy that will make the United States an even safer investment for people purchasing our debt, which would mean interest rates would come down longer. And then when interest rates do come down, then he'll lock them in one more time for a longer period of time. So I think a lot of people don't understand Donald Trump. And I'm not saying I'm an expert, but of all the presidents that have ever been, he's the guy I've been studying the longest because I've been studying him way before he was a politician. And I've spent time with his attorney, George Ross, a lot of quality time with George. And I've know many people who've known Trump. I've gotten a chance to interact with Donald Trump a couple of times, very minor, just ask him a couple questions in a press room. But I've never been that close to any other president. I've never read a president's books the way I've read his books and tried to get inside his head and think the way he thinks. And so I've, along the way, back since 2016, I would have these hypotheses. I'd say, this is what I think he's going to do. And then I would try to reverse engineer what he is thinking based on what I see him doing. And this is where now at this stage here in 2025, I've come to these conclusions. And I think so far, it's actually kind of played out the way I thought it would. And I don't think that's because I'm genius. I just think it's because it's logical. And if you understand the thinking, it's not going to comport with what you're used to hearing from Wall Street analysts or what you're hearing from politicians. He's neither of those things. He's a Main Street guy. He's a Main Street investor. He didn't make his billions in the stock market. He made it on Main Street. And he thinks like a business person, not a politician. And, you know, you can see a lot of people think he's a grifter. I don't know. I think he was making more money outside than in. You know, maybe he is. But it sure seems to me like his only motivation appears to be actually getting the job done. So I'm not here to be a Trump fanboy. I do think he runs the risk of losing control. If he loses control of inflation and it costs him the midterm, then and we get, before we get some permanent fixes in place, then we could have the pendulum swing the other way. Somebody could come in who's aggressively big government, and we could have aggressive regulations, aggressive spending, aggressive, what I would consider to be inflationary government stimulus checks to non-productive segments of the economy. And it could all unwind. So right now it looks more promising than not, in my estimation. But I think these next 2 years in particular, and maybe the next 4 to 5 years, depending on what happens at the midterms, are really going to be telling.
之前呢，我在跟资深的投资经理人 Michael Lebowitz 我们两个对话的那一期里面哈，我们就提到过，那现在呢，美联储非常尴尬，就降息也不是呢，不降息也不是。那从历史的角度上来说的话，哈，其实呢，我们跟70年代这大通胀这个末期这将近20%的基准利率来比呢，还是有很大差距的。但是呢，我们也不能绝对从这个基准利率的高低来看，还得呢从变化的程度上来看。
Okay, so when you mention interest rate, you mean the interest rate, because the interest rate for the Fed is different interest rate for the people who are getting the loan or the business who are getting the loan. So what we are seeing at this moment, as Fed is lowering rate, the rate for getting a loan is actually not changing so much, and the 10-year yield is actually still stay pretty high. If the Trump is trying to lower the interest rate to stimulate the economy, but for a lot of lenders, they're looking at the 10-year. So we're kind of stuck here.
Yeah, there's two parts to it. And this is the challenge the Fed has. The Fed can make it easier for banks to lend, but it can't force them to do it.
Right.
And what you've got with the banks, and I just did a presentation on this Tuesday night, what you've got with the banks is a situation where their balance sheets are in trouble. If you go back and look at the federal funds rate going back to 2008, it basically right around December of 2008 hit zero.
Right.
And it stayed zero for a long, long time. And you had treasuries being bought and used and put on people's balance sheets for many years at very, very low interest rates. We're talking 25, 50 basis points, maybe 100 basis points, very, very low. Well, when we started this interest rate hike cycle, it started at 25 basis points and it went up to 5.25 or 525 basis points. If you do the math on that, that was a 20x increase. It was unprecedented. People talk about, but interest rates are a lot lower, than when Volcker had interest rates up over 20% in the early 80s. Yes, but he started from a base of about 8 or 9%. So as a percentage change, he basically doubled and a little bit more, maybe 2.5, right? But this was 20x. So if I'm holding a bunch of those balance sheets, whether I'm a pension fund, whether I'm a insurance company, whether I am a hedge fund, doesn't matter. If I'm loaded up and I'm a bank, if I'm loaded up with those bonds and you jack interest rates up that far, that fast, on a mark-to-market basis, I lost a lot of equity, maybe all my equity. I might be teetering on insolvency, and the only way I can keep my doors open is to continue to borrow and hope that at some point I can make enough profit and or interest rates will come back down and mitigate some of that loss. And so if you have insurance companies suffering big losses and they don't want to liquidate their holdings because they're going to take the hit, then they're going to have to raise their premiums. And we've seen a lot of that, right? If you're going to see banks fail, when this interest rate cycle first really hit, you saw Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, was it Credit Suisse, I think? We saw a lot of these banks in big, big trouble. And just because you're not hearing about that anymore doesn't mean it's not happening. So coming full circle, if you create an environment where interest rates were jacked up 20 times and then you back them off a little bit, the damage is still on the balance sheets. And if I'm a bank, I'm hesitant to take credit risk because if I take a loss, I'm going to have to liquidate my balance sheet and realize those losses. And so this is the challenge. This is the challenge. If we lower interest rates a ton, and we don't have offsetting productivity to absorb it, This is very important, right? Productivity can mitigate inflation. Powell doesn't think that way. Powell only thinks about diminishing demand. He doesn't think about supply. Trump, on the other hand, I believe, is wanting to stimulate productivity on the thesis that if we're productive, I can absorb a lot of the inflation and you can lower interest rates. We can save the financial system. And I think the wild card right now is the basis trade with the hedge funds. The way I understand it, there's about $1 trillion in notional value of bonds that are in trouble right now because the hedge funds had bet 50 to 1, 100 to 1 that the interest rates would go down. And to your point, they went up. And so like long-term capital management in the late 90s and kind of what happened in the financial system in the GFC, it could be that those falling bond values could trigger a systemic crisis. So if I'm the Fed and I'm saying, okay, my job is employment and price stability, and price stability defined as inflation
Stay around 2%.
at 2%, right? Which I think is a completely bogus stat, but let's just go with it. And I say, okay, that's what my primary thing to do is. And then I see the financial system in trouble. I'm going to save the financial system.
Right, because that's his job.
And to save the financial system, I'm going to have to lower rates. And the only way I can lower rates, truly, that isn't passive, is I have to actually go into the market through the open market operations and purchase those bonds. And then I sequester them in bank reserves so they don't get into the money supply. So I don't trigger inflation, at least monetary inflation. And I think they can actually pull that off because Trump is trying to rein in spending rather than aggressively spending. So I think if I had to bet money right now, I think this battle between Trump and Powell, Powell is going to capitulate. I think in some ways Trump is actually making it harder on himself because it actually makes Powell, I think Powell would do it anyway, but now he's resisting because it looks like he's bending the knee to Trump, right? By lowering rates. I think the hedge fund situation is probably going to be the difference maker. And I think all things being equal, and I'm really watching that. I'm hardly an expert, right? But I watch it because if you start to see real severe stress in the bond markets because of these hedge funds, this basis trade unraveling, and if that has a threat on the financial system because $1 trillion of margin calls hit, right? You'll see it in the dollar, and you'll see it in the repo market. And it's hard, especially me. I'm not an expert. I'm still learning, but this is, I've learned a lot since the GFC. And of course I hang out with George Gammon and he's a genius when it comes to all this stuff. But I think that maybe not this upcoming meeting, May 7th, but maybe by June, you might see some movement, especially if Trump's productivity continues to improve employment and inflation. The irony is that high employment is a trigger to the Fed that we have potential for inflation. So that's the way they think. So you kind of have to understand the way they think. But I think if I were to bet that there's more pressure to lower rates than to raise them. And I think that that's probably what's going to end up happening. And the only way I think the Fed can realistically do it, if the banks aren't healed enough to really start to lend again and compete. And lending means they're competing. When banks want to lend, they're competing and they lower rates in order to do that. When they don't want to lend, if they just want really simple arbitrage, I'll take free money from the Fed and I'll invest it in something like treasuries, and I'm just going to sit in the sideline and the Main Street's not going to get the money. And that's why I think there's a big opportunity in private capital.
刚才 Ross 提的这个 cash future basis trade 可能让大家有点疑惑了哈，我给大家稍微解释一下。就这个 cash future basis trade 呢，它是一种通过读美国国债未来短期价格变化来实现套利的这么一种操作哈。 对冲基金很常做这种交易，这种交易的概念呢，就是比如说此时此刻10年期的美国国债价格呢是100块钱，那未来1个月之内10年期美国国债预期的价格呢会达到105，那这个月里面不就出现了一个5块钱或者是说5%的套利空间吗？那这个时候，如果说对冲基金拿手里面这个资产去做抵押贷款，然后拿到好比说100万去收了一波美国国债，哪怕是贷款利率每个月只有1%，那这不还剩4%的利润空间吗？但是，一旦这个市场上面在1个月之内出现了什么莫名其妙的变动，那这个美债的价格呢，可能就会跌到比如说100块05分。那这笔买卖不仅赚不到钱，还会出现这 margin call，也就是说放贷方追缴保证金的这么一个情况。那这个对冲基金为了还钱，就只好火速卖掉手里面可以快速变现的资产，去填这 margin call 的窟窿嘛。这个时候股市呢，就8、9不离十，就会出现一个下跌的情况。因为公开市场的流动性最强嘛，那套现也是最容易的。
The way I explain inflation, because I always try and explain it like I'm talking to somebody 5 years old, 8 years old.
Yeah, please.
Right? And so the way I've learned to explain inflation is if you have 10 people that are all dying of thirst and they have 10 $1 bills and you have one water bottle and you're going to conduct an auction and highest bidder is going to get the one water bottle, you're going to start the bidding at $1. Well, we all know that somebody's going to bid all the way up to 10 because they can, and the first person to do it is going to get the water bottle. Now, if somebody who doesn't have an economic education comes along and says, well, we need to stimulate this economy, so we're going to give everybody $100. And so you hold the same auction, you got one bottle of water, 10 people, each with $100, and you start the bidding at $1, the first person who bid to 100 is going to get the one water bottle. The water bottle didn't get any bigger. It won't quench any more thirst. All that we did was we added more currency into the economy and we didn't add any offsetting production. That's classic inflation. Now, if you were instead to focus on the productivity side and say, okay, we've got these 10 people and we already gave them the $100. However, we're going to focus our effort not on printing more money, but on producing 9 more water bottles. Now we have 10 bottles of water in this economy, productivity. We're going to hold a bid, and the first person who bids $1 is going to get a bottle of water. The second person who bids $1 is going to get a bottle of water. And there's enough productivity to satisfy all the demand. And even though there's $100 in each person's hand, they're only going to spend $1. And the water bottle is only going to cost $1. And so you can suck up inflation, even if it's the cat's already out of the bag, with productivity.
所以说，如果我们把这通货膨胀这概念从货币价值上面剥离开的话，跟实际的经济运转方式结合在一起的话，我们就会发现 productivity 生产效率和 velocity 交易速度这2个因素的变化才是控制通货膨胀数据的重要因素，也是川普现在重点关注的方向嘛。这个其实也是挺有道理的，因为呢，相对于金融市场川普的强项或者说最有经验的领域是实体经济，也就是说实际产出商品和服务的这个生产端。那这里就出现一个问题了，川普可是没有第3任期了哈。他最好别有第3任期那他实现自己目标的可能性到底有多大呢？
And then for the velocity, if Trump is trying to get the velocity to pick up, it's going to take a long time because there's lagging effect on everything, especially doing business. It takes years to, build a business, especially if it's manufacturing. Trump only has 4 years. So I'm not sure what's the possibility of him actually achieving the goal of that. He is for sure, I hope for sure, not going to stay for another 4 years, which means within 4 years, we may see another different kind of picture, political-wise. And that...
Yeah, well, he may only have 2 years.
Because of midterm?
Because of the midterms.
So the confidence of the, let's say, the investors from, doesn't matter if it's inside of the United States or outside of the United States, within 2 years, are they going to wait? Because if I'm the investor, I'll be like, if the political climate is changing in 2 years, then why am I risking my own money on building something that take more than 2 years?
Well, that's part of the uncertainty that we have, but let's take a look at some things in the past that might comfort us a little bit. Mm-hmm. Obamacare, right? They pushed Obamacare through. They spent really every ounce of political capital they had Pelosi famously saying, we've got to pass the bill to see what's in it, doing the vote in the middle of the night, Christmas time, whatever they did. And there were all kinds of calls as soon as the Trump administration got in to unwind it. But they couldn't, right? They couldn't. Now you go into the COVID lockdowns and the idea that you're going to lock these businesses down and then somewhere down the road, you're just going to lift the prohibitions and they're just magically going to fire up like a light switch. But that isn't what happens. That isn't what happens. And so you've got this inertia that you can create in a short period of time. Obama didn't have much time to get the Obamacare in place, but he did it, and he did it in such a way that it is stuck. Right? There are many, many businesses that went broke in COVID that are gone forever. They're not coming back. Those people have moved on to do other things. Those things are lost. So I think that if there is the right kind of pressure, so for example, let's just take Taiwan Semiconductor right now. Let's say Taiwan Semiconductor takes $100 billion and invests it in a factory or factories here in the United States. If we get a change of regime, it's not a simple thing to just move that factory back again. And so there is the possibility that if you move aggressively enough in things that are extremely difficult to move, the pain of moving them is extreme, and we're experiencing that. But once they're there, the pain of moving them back is also extreme. And if some of the benefits begin to accrue and some of that momentum and infrastructure is got enough inertia where it's going to stay put, then it could be that even if a hostile regime came in and tried to unwind it all, they would struggle, much the way Trump struggled to get rid of Obamacare. And, you know, that can end up being a good thing. So, and of course, if anything less than an overtly hostile regime comes in, if even somebody who's modestly supportive or status quo just leaves it not to rock the boat. In other words, we're experiencing an extreme, a very aggressive administration right now. And I would argue that Obama was pretty aggressive.
低买高卖这个概念呢，是一个深入人心的获益方式哈。但如果你看过我上一期跟帮助富爸爸 Robert Kiyosaki 实现零纳税的税务策略师 Tom Wheelwright， 我们两个的对谈内容的话呢，你肯定就会知道，低买高卖并不是这些专业投资人或者企业家的获益方式。因为税法里面非常明确地表达了这么个概念哈，就是说政府呢会扶持甚至成为专业投资人的投资杠杆，而惩罚业余投资人进行简单的套利行为。如果大家想听 Tom 这个投资家背后的策划人来颠覆一下大家对于投资和税法的认知的话呢，那欢迎去看那一期哈。那像 Ross 作为实体经济的投资人呢，他关注的点更多的是一个资产能够持续输出价值的能力。We are moving to this direction that private, I would say private market, but something that's more for the people instead of just for the elite. That's, you know, the Wall Street, the money game, right?
If you could change one thing in investment philosophy that I think would make the most impact, it would be what Robert Kiyosaki taught all those years ago, which is instead of investing for buy low, sell high, hoping a greater fool will come along and buy the same asset for a higher price. And a lot of times you could count on that because you had falling interest rates and you had printing of money, therefore you were riding the inflation wave. But if we were just to simply focus on productivity, if you bought an apartment building based on its cash flow and not on the idea that it was going to have a falling cap rate and you were going to sell the same cash flow to a subsequent investor for a higher price, the same is true with a stock. If you bought a stock based on its productivity, its dividend, if you will, rather than the speculation that somehow it's either going to grow into some spectacular revenue and profitability model somewhere down the road, maybe, or some greater fool is going to come along and purchase it from you. I think if we just really focused on what's real and essential, which is productivity, or most stock investors, most Wall Street, they all focus on asset price. And they only talk about earnings from the standpoint of what its trigger will be on asset price. But if you literally just said, okay, I want to get a 10% yield on my cash, the stock is yielding a $1 a year dividend, therefore I'm willing to pay $10 a share for it. And you say, well, it's selling for 20, not willing to pay that, right? And the no bid will bring it back down until the going rate will get paid. That's why a guy like Warren Buffett is sitting on billions and billions and billions of dollars in cash, because the ratios, the earnings to price to earnings ratios don't make any sense. That's why a lot of real estate investors are sitting on the sideline right now, because the price of houses in particular haven't gone up as fast as the price of rents. That's the bad news. The good news is rents will not fall as far as prices if this thing unwinds. And so
Right.
as a real estate investor, you just have to kind of know where you're at. If you can buy something that makes sense today based on the numbers, based on the cash flow, you buy it.
Yes.
I don't
Yeah.
care what the interest rate is.
Cash
Because if
flow
it-
is the
it-
king, is not the cash.
Kiyosaki, it was so simple. I almost think I love the guy. We're good friends, but I think he almost oversimplified it. He made it so simple, you missed it. I missed it. And when I really understood the brilliance and the simplicity of taking the fundamental investing approach of a Warren Buffett and applying it to Main Street, Kiyosaki had it dialed. And I think if we just do that and discipline ourselves to do that, then I think that we're going to find plenty of opportunity. In the world right now, the opportunity is on the debt side, because you can lend people money, get a decent yield, and as long as there's good protective equity, on a property you wouldn't mind having anyway, well, then that can be okay. And then again, sitting on cash and just waiting for your opportunity.
And then also, I think a lot of people, because they focus too much on the equity side, on the price change up and down, they forgot that there's also another side, which is lending. Sometimes when the market is going sideways or going to another direction, which equity price is not making sense, like chase for the equity price doesn't make sense anymore, people can think about, maybe we can stand on the other side of the game and be the lender, or make the money out of a steady repayment of the loan. You mentioned that before, that the debt is basically everywhere in the society, and we have to understand debt, and we live in that. But a lot of people are chasing this concept that no debt. I don't want any debt, like Dave Ramsey, right? That's a iconic figure of no debt. So what is your perspective? Do you think debt is something that people should be considering, or necessarily to have on their balance sheet? Or what do you think people should do with debt, and how to understand that?
So debt's a power tool, and I've been on the wrong end of it. I overused it and got caught in a downdraft and lopped off a big chunk of my net worth because I didn't understand how to use the tool prudently. And part of it, for me, was I was in the business of brokering debt. And so I had a cash flowing business and a non-cash flowing real estate portfolio, using the cash flow from the one to support the other, which was largely speculative. When real estate values went down, which I never thought could happen to the degree that they did in the GFC, that debt became a millstone around my neck, and I didn't have the cash flow to deal with it, both from the property or from the business, because I brokered debt. So I do think whatever you're doing, you always have to pay attention to single point failure. But with that said, obviously there's two types of debt. There's productive debt and there's non-productive debt, right? If you're borrowing to consume and then you have to pay that out off the sweat of your back, that's a millstone around your neck, and that's going to get you in a lot of trouble, right? That's what Dave Ramsey is against, and I agree with him. Now, if you understand the basic concept of arbitrage and you understand how to make money with money, if I can borrow money at 8% and I can put it in my inventory in the store we just talked about and turn it 4 times a year at 10% profit, make 40%, 8% is an excellent investment. And so it really depends on your ability to manage cash flow and to manage that debt and use it properly. But it's a power tool. And of course, if we do have inflation, and right now we still have a Fed who believes its mandate is to create 2% a year inflation right now, they've been trying to get back down to it. Okay, but they're not intending to go past it. They're not intending to make things less expensive. They would try to inflate if they accidentally created deflation. They're more afraid of deflation than they are of inflation. They just have this like Goldilocks sweet spot that they want to try to live in. So as long as we have that system, debt is a way to short the dollar. In other words, if I can borrow dollars today and put them into an asset at today's prices, and then down the road, say, for example, a house at 7.2% average annualized inflation, if I buy a $100,000 house today, 10 years from now, it's $200,000. So if I bought it at 100% debt, no money down, as long as I could make the payment, then, and say the rent and the tax breaks made the payment, then a year later, I have $100,000, a real profit to me that cost me nothing. But if I bought two houses right next to each other, instead of paying $100,000 for the one house, I bought two houses for $50,000 down and 50% debt, and they doubled in value in 10 years. I could sell the one and pay the other off, right? And so this is the power of debt. Debt allows you to use inflation to your advantage and to outgrow inflation. It's almost very difficult to outgrow inflation without debt. And so if you're going to be in a debt-driven society and inflation is baked in the cake, you're going to have to learn how to be a skillful user of the power tool of debt. But you also, I think, have to devote yourself to the discipline and the education of actually knowing how to do that well. If you're not willing to put that time and effort in, it's not a tool you want to play with lightly. Let's just say that.
You also said that people don't have debt, the government will do it for you. That's basically the part of the inflation comes in.
You do listen to my stuff.
I
Yeah,
do.
that's exactly right. We have to have ever-growing debt. You say, well, I don't want to be in debt. Well, every child born is born into debt because the government borrows on behalf of the people, pledges their earnings as collateral for that. And so, and then they tax you to make the payment. So, you're going to be in debt whether you like it or not. The only question is, are you going to profit from it or not?
大家都看到这儿了，那我也来问 Ross 一个大家应该都知道答案，但是每个人答案呢又都不太一样的这么个问题。
And yesterday I got a friend came in town and then he asked me a question like, what is capitalism and what is the difference between capitalism and socialism? And then I was like, okay, that's a very interesting question, but because most of people, even though they went to school and all that, they still don't understand what's the major difference there. So capitalism, how do you define capitalism? How do you explain to somebody who's 5 years old difference between capitalism and socialism?
So first you have to define what capital is and what it isn't. And so I kind of throw the textbook definition away and I just use common sense. And I guest hosted Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad radio show several months ago. And I talked about this exact topic in my opening monologue. And then I interviewed a young lady who had kind of flipped her perspective based on being a big government supporter to somebody who became an entrepreneur and really was more for Main Street than the government. And so I thought it was really interesting. But capital is goods and services. It's what we want. It's the stuff that we want. It's things of real value. Money is a derivative of capital. So it's a place to store the value of something that we've produced until we're ready to exchange it for something we want to consume. Okay, and so that's money. And so one of the most fundamental aspects of money is purchasing power preservation. And the dollar, which is currency, is very bad at that. Gold has been much better at that. So gold, I would say, is money. And then the next derivative from there is currency. Currency is a medium of exchange. And it used to be that money and currency were one and the same. We had gold coins, we had silver coins. And so we had preservation of value and a medium of exchange in one unit. But we separated those things. And so we had capital, we have money, then we have currency. And then the derivative of currency is credit. And everything in our system is credit. So we're very far removed from capital. So capitalism is stuff. Capital is stuff. Capitalism is the creation of stuff. So a communistic country still is a capitalistic country because they produce. It's just who owns and benefits from the property and the work. So in a free country where private property is available to the common man, then that's what I call Main Street capitalism or constitutional capitalism. The idea that we have the right to own property. If you want to own property yourself, if you want to be able to go to work and keep the fruits of your labor, then you're a capitalist. A socialist wants the government to control those things, not own them, just control them. But control and ownership kind of go hand in hand. Communism is where the government owns it. And so if you want personal property, personal wealth, personal freedom, you don't want socialism, you don't want communism, and you don't want fascism. You just want Main Street capitalism. Give me private property rights, give me the freedom to travel, to assemble, to share ideas, to enter into contracts, to do business, to keep my earnings. Right? That's what America was founded on. It was the American dream. American dream wasn't, oh, you get to own a house. A lot of people equate that.
Right. Property
It was
is
that
not
you get to own
house,
property.
not just house.
You get to own the
Yes.
words that come out of your mouth. You get to own the thoughts that you think in your head. You get to own what you grow, the land, your
Yeah.
home. You get to own that. The rest of it are just economic vehicles that surround that. So we create money, currency, stock markets, we create all this stuff around this concept. And the problem that we have in America is we've forgotten what capitalism is. And it's become turned into a dirty word because it's been conflated to mean monopoly. And we think, oh, capitalists are monopolies. And a capitalist then puts their boot on the neck of labor. And because labor has single point failure, it's binary. Either I have a job and income or I don't. And I can't compete with the big person because they have economies of scale. They can build the factory, buy the equipment, pay for the software. And so either I have to work for them or I have to work for somebody else, or I have to somehow find a way to get big enough to compete with them on my own. And it becomes very challenging. But in a decentralized environment where we are today, we don't need market makers. We can find each other. Technology used to cost billions and millions of dollars. And today, we have it at our fingertips on the cheap. This is, television studio technology, things that you would spend tons of money, 50 years ago. And today, look at us, we're doing this and it costs us next to nothing.
好，那我们来快速总结一下哈。这一期我和 Ross 讨论了一下经济衰退和通货膨胀在实际经济里面这个呈现模式是什么样的。那这个跟金融领域的现象还是完全不一样的。如果只是在这个金融层面去看的话呢，经济衰退是纸质资产价格下跌，投资人从纸质资产这个市场里面撤出。但是呢，如果我们看这个资金走向的话，经济衰退会造成社会里面的这个经济结构出现一些变化，外加上目前川普对于生产端的这个强刺激，实体经济的投资反而会成为资金涌入的一个领域。通货膨胀从货币角度上来说呢，是货币贬值，但是如果从实体经济的角度上来说呢，就是生产效率和交易运转速度的一种不平衡。而川普的一系列操作呢，都是在通过提高生产效率和交易速度来稳定经济的。但是由于他只有2年的时间了，所以现在他这些迷之操作都是希望赶紧用最短的时间把政策先定下来，尽量保证美国未来很多年都不会再偏离这种以实体经济生产为主要关注点的这个经济模式。对于专业投资人来说呢，其实呢，与其说现金为王，我们更需要认识到的这么个概念就是说现金流为王，尤其呢是在市场不稳定的时候。另外呢 Ross 也提到了债务呢是现代经济的血液，大家都是逃不掉的。它确实有风险，但是呢，我打个不是特恰当的比方债务呢就像我后面这比特犬，你越是怕它，它越觉得自己是一家之主，想干嘛干嘛；你越是不怕它呢，它就越觉得好，你说什么都对，还能主动干起保镖的活。 这比喻确实是不太准确哈，但是大家意会一下就行，行吧？那这一期就先说到这儿了，咱们下期见，拜拜。你也不是比特犬呢，你是拉布拉多多。手手，谢谢。哎，你怎么把人推走了呢？哎，不讲礼貌。哥哥，你过来。手手，谢谢。哟，手手，哎哎哎，你给我这只手手，这只手手。哎呦，谢谢。哎。